Rose.
How are you
Thank you
doing?
for joining
I'm
us.
so happy to be here.
Awesome. I want to first pay homage to Black Noise and your recognition of hip hop.
Hmm.
That was something that was really important for me in my youth, and coming across your book did wonders for me.
Mm.
And so I want to start there before we pivot into your new work.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And astounds me how much that book was like resonant and helpful, especially for Black young people. And it really, for those who don't know the book, it's the sort of the first academic full treatment that was published and visible of the emergence of hip hop. Why did it come about when it did? But one of the things I think it did for a lot of people, I'm hoping my new book will do, which is speak for people about what they're dealing with that nobody wants to hear about, that many people deny, and that add to their suffering and make it harder for them to even do as well as they're doing with, say, hip hop, which is a worldwide phenomenon that
Right,
everybody should be excited about.
right.
Well, in some cases not, but you know what I mean.
Uh huh.
So that's what I'm hoping will happen with meta racism. That kind of impact could happen twice.
Uh huh.
Cross your
It
fingers.
will happen.
All right. Well, thank you, dear. From
It
your
will
mouth to
happen.
God's ear.
When I came across the title Meta
Hmm.
Racism, and it first, let me say, it dropped already. Meta
Hmm.
Racism has been published
Hmm.
March 2nd.
Hmm.
When I encountered the title and your name along with it, I it piqued such a curiosity.
Hmm.
And for myself and for others, can you talk a little bit about the title?
Hmm.
Um, Meta,
Hmm.
that part
Yeah.
matched with the racism. I was really curious and I didn't want to make any assumptions.
Mm.
And I want to like give the floor to you to
Yeah.
really flesh that out for
I
us.
appreciate that. So, as I said about Black noise, there's a long history of Black people really trying to explain very politely most of the time
Mm-hmm.
that they're experiencing things that are very specific, that aren't just discrimination or class discrimination, but they are anti-Black policy and practice.
Uh-huh.
And that even after the civil rights movement, a lot of these things are either being destroyed or were never actually realized.
Mm-hmm.
So the same thing with Black Noise. Both of these books, and really my whole career, has been really trying to figure out how can I say something valuable, meaningful, well-researched, serious,
Mm-hmm.
but also accessible
Right.
for people, everyday people to say, oh, yes, thank you. I know it in my gut, and you don't know me. I know they know more than I do at certain levels,
Right.
but I'm trying to translate it for a broader audience so that people can begin to see what they're up against and be more activated, more thoughtful, more frustrated, and do good things with that kind of
Mm-hmm.
knowledge. So, meta racism is really a book about systemic racism.
Uh-huh.
That's the first most important thing. And the reason I wanted to write about systemic racism was a lot of good reasons.
Mm-hmm.
One, my students, even at an Ivy League school, Black, white, brown, Asian American, all over the world, global, didn't really believe there was racism anymore.
Right.
And as time went on in the classroom, I was like, wait, y'all, every generation got a little bit less believing.
Right.
So I said, let me really show them. Then I said, wow, this is complex. How am I going to show them this?
Mm-hmm.
That led to a bigger project. Well, let me do more research. And as I did more research, I realized that systems and systemic racism
Mm-hmm.
isn't just a word for society.
Right.
It's a word for a way of understanding how things interconnect. It could be a solar system.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a healthcare system, right?
Right.
But when it's a system that generates racism, the interconnections work to create effects that are greater than the individual parts,
Okay.
right? So if
Right.
you have education, criminal justice, they're both horrible, say, discrimination policies going
Mm-hmm.
on.
Right.
But if you connect them with the school to prison pipeline,
Mm-hmm.
you get a meta effect. Meta means a greater impact than the sum of the parts.
Right.
So now you think over time, these things connect, it gets bigger.
Mm-hmm.
Then it connects over here and it gets bigger and it goes around and around. And the longer it happens,
Uh-huh.
the more powerful it is. So that's why it's not structural,
Right.
but that's what I want meta to be like. We're dealing with a level of impact that we don't even fully understand. I know I'm still figuring it out in some ways.
Right. But how do you distill something so complex,
Mm-hmm.
right? For myself,
Mhm.
for students,
Mhm.
for, common folk.
Mhm.
How do you do that? with this particular
no, trust me,
material?
I spent a couple of years trying to figure out what the structure of the book was going to be, because that was really important. If you lose people with the structure, it's hard to write your way back out.
Right.
So I basically divided it into two parts. And the first part is, first of all, just describing systemic racism in the broadest sense. But then I said, well, let me really tell them what a system is. So, the first chapter is kind of a primer. What is a system? There are 4 characteristics. Does it have separate elements? Do those elements impact each other? Are the effects of those elements in relation to each other more powerful, meta, than they would be on their own?
Right.
And do they happen over time?
Right.
So you can't have a struck system if it's just me and you one day interacting.
Right.
That's not a system. We need time, we need multiplicities, and we need this compound impact. So the first thing is to break that down and then give Black examples. Some of them are true, some of them are invented for the purposes of saying, what would you do here, what would you do there?
Right.
Then there's the second chapter, which is the devil in the details, which is, here's how it happens for us.
Okay.
And then there's, okay, let's explain 3 stories you think you know. Trayvon Martin,
Okay.
Michael Brown, and Kelly Williams Bolar.
Okay.
Now, I chose them because they're far enough ago for people to have a better historical, not even history, it's just 10, 15 years ago. But, you need more data to make this case, and I didn't want to come short with what happened yesterday.
Right.
Because yesterday's going to happen again.
Right.
So, So I said, okay, let me take these 3 stories you think you know. And then I said, I'm going to tell them from a systems perspective. And then it's like, oh, people are like, oh, that had nothing to do. Oh, I thought Trayvon was blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So, and then you come out saying, well, let me take these new glasses you got me, Trisha, and go wander around the world. That's my little fantasy. People put the book down or keep it in their backpack.
Okay.
And then just, walk around like, wait a minute, how does that connect? How does this connect?
I want to pivot and then we'll get back, right? Social determinants. How does any of that fit into the systemic?
Yeah.
Can you
I can
connect those for us?
Well, I'm going to quibble with that phrase, which we use a lot.
Right.
It comes out of social science, but particularly out of public health.
Yep.
And that's where they say that they're actually implicitly saying there are 2 big kinds of determinants. One is genetic,
Right.
which is the one they really like to, in general, rely on. They feel like they're facts over there.
Right.
And over here, social determinants. Stuff goes on in the world we don't know nothing about. We
Right.
can't pay attention to. We can't measure it. We don't know anything about it. It's terrible. It's unfortunate.
Right.
But this kind of unfortunate framework is the myth-making that happened with Trayvon and others that hide what is a very clear sense of policies and practices interconnecting over time to have a compound effect on health, on economic viability, on education and the quality of that education, impact on policing and the treatment of the community. All of that is deeply interconnected to create social determinants.
Right.
So I'll give you a quick example. If you are African American, you are 75% of the people who live near a polluting factory are Black.
Right.
City by city by city. So that means if you're Black and you're already dealing with redlining historically, and then contemporary forms of housing discrimination and affordability, because that's what, that's how these things interconnect, you're going to be very likely dealing with all kinds of particulate toxins. So then they're going to tell you got asthma because you got some genetic problem from Africa. I'm not even kidding. And you're like, well, no, actually, it's about living in this neighborhood in Chicago.
Right. Louisiana's
Cancer Alley.
Right.
So then you say to them, look at this. And, well, you don't really know for sure if this toxin caused this cancer. Man, get out of here.
Because you arrived
And then they
with
tell you it's a
something.
social determinant.
Okay.
That's called racism.
Right.
And it's called not just personal individual racism, which is what we focus on in this country.
Meta.
But the systemic, which creates meta effects that are so profound. And it's diabetes, all of this. Well, let's look for a gene. You don't need to look for a gene.
Let's look for this food.
Food and high stress, chronic illnesses, immune-based chronic illnesses.
That compound.
They compound over time. Why? Because people are finally saying, yes, racism is a chronic stressor. So let's just say you have a potential to get some disease, what they call a recessive, capacity. You live in one of these neighborhoods, it's going to be a very aggressive, articulated tendency in your gene pool. It's going to encourage it to come out.
Right.
It may not be the original cause, but it's a
It's
climate
kinda
exacerbator.
like a chicken pox or shingle or
Shingles,
something
right.
like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. I really needed that.
Oh, good.
You this book is written around a certain era, and
Mm-hmm.
it's post
Civil
civil
rights era.
rights.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about why you centered that for us.
Yeah, I did have a kind of snippy agenda with that
Okay.
one. I find as both a teacher and as an everyday citizen and watching the news that one of the most powerful ways that people who were not happy about the success of the civil rights movement,
Mhm.
I don't know what to call them. They're not all white. They're often other groups. They're not all conservative. So I got to come up with a name for them. Anti-civil rights, activists.
Right.
But one of the ways they've been really successful in convincing people that we're at a place of equity that we're not is by pointing to the success of the civil rights movement.
Okay.
Oh, Martin King did a fantastic job. And even he said, why, let's not judge people, right, by the
Right.
color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He didn't mean what they said. They
Right.
just took it
Took
and
it
ran
out
with
of
it. Reagan was
context.
early
Right.
on. So what happens is, that's Ronald Reagan,
Mhm.
sorry, the ex-president.
Right.
But what happens is that whole narrative looks like it's supporting King and it's supporting equity. And they'll say, we don't need voting rights, Section A. We don't need this because there's no more of these issues.
Mm-hmm.
That statement denies the existence of systemic racism.
Right.
You cannot make that statement if you can prove systemic racism.
Right.
So that was my first agenda, which was, don't be over here talking all this nonsense. You know it's nonsense,
Mhm.
but I'm going to show people who are naively, hopefully thinking this is true. Oh, it's so great. There's a lot of white folk who don't study this stuff, who don't know what it means to live in a Black community.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very comfortable thinking we made it. And I want just to have them think for a minute that they might be being bamboozled from my point of view, and they might be allies.
Right.
And that's a helpful thing. The second thing is that the post-civil rights era, because of this idea that, hey, we made it, we've overcome, makes people angry at Black people for asking for equity.
Okay.
Because that's where the kind of resentment, white resentment, and what's now reverse discrimination
Mm-hmm.
comes alive.
Okay.
And so I don't want to just tackle that. I want to tackle the origins. To say, look, if I can prove this to you, can this exist? And they'll say no. I'll say, okay, well, come over here with me. And then I don't have to have this debate. There are Black people who don't like to work. I'm saying, yeah, there's Puerto Ricans and Irish and Italians
Right.
and Jews. Everybody
That's
got somebody who doesn't want to
preposterous,
work.
right.
Why are we having this conversation?
Uh-huh.
So I just want to change the terms, and I want to give young people
Mm-hmm.
a place to go to think about it more deeply with their teachers and with their parents and with everybody else.
Okay. And so I have a final question,
Mhm.
and it's why is a systems analysis of racism more helpful
Mm-hmm.
and your words hopeful,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right, than an analysis that focuses on individuals? So you mentioned the individual and the larger piece that leads to meta,
Right.
But why is it
Yeah.
important to distinguish the two?
So, all right, let's think. I'm going to give you a little quiz here, an on-air quiz. All
Oh,
right. So
gosh.
it's so simple, honey. It's so simple. Trust me.
Okay.
So, let's take Eric Garner, that horrible,
Okay.
horrible incident.
Mm-hmm.
Who was responsible for what happened to him? I'll give you a few options.
In my opinion,
Yeah. Okay. No, you go ahead.
Okay, in my opinion, and I'll calling them perpetrators, right?
Mhm.
The people who perpetrated his death.
Okay.
For me,
But what
is
did we learn in the
responsible.
media about what happened and why it happened?
That he brought it on himself.
A.
That he, was looking for cigarettes.
He was
right?
breaking the law
Breaking
because
the
he was
law.
selling
Right.
individual
Right.
cigarettes
Mhm.
to poor people who can't afford a pack of cigarettes, parentheses.
Mhm.
Okay. And what else? He was too
Um,
big and too scary, couldn't bring him down.
This is true.
How
And
many,
he agitated.
He's
right?
he
He was an
and that's how
agitator.
he brought it on himself, right?
Mhm.
So here's what happens. When you tell individual stories, you get two versions of. You get that first version, which you said was my opinion. You said your opinion
Right.
was that the cops exacerbated in a situation that did not need violence.
Correct.
The man had been there for years,
Correct.
and he can get frustrated, right? He's like any other human. He's like,
Right.
you harass me every day.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's the one story, which is all about him alone.
Uh-huh.
The other side is all about the cops alone.
Correct.
Nobody's explaining why this neighborhood is so poor and so of color that everybody can only afford one cigarette. Nobody's asking why there are no additional jobs for the people there. Nobody's
Right.
asking why the cops think they should police in this stop and frisk,
In
broken
such a way.
windows pattern that creates the kind of hostility and fear
Right.
that the whole community lives with. So what I want is, hey, look, tell Eric Garner's story. But you're not going to do him right unless you connect that story to what he's really dealing with. And that connects him to everybody else in his community.
Right.
And now we're done asking questions like, there was one bad cop or 5 bad cops. You'd be like, okay, that's fine. Thank you for telling me. I have some other things I want to talk about. And then let's move into how do we change this for everybody? We can't change it by just changing Staten Island.
Okay.
So that's the 2 reasons. One, you lose sight of how his life and the behavior of the police are part of a much broader, more impactful system. That even if he didn't get, horribly murdered that day, which was terrible, something else was more likely to happen to him.
Right.
And everybody else in that neighborhood.
There was a risk.
A huge risk that was generated by social policy and practices, interconnected over time to have meta effects.
Thank you so much for this conversation. We're looking forward to this book. Any final remarks?
Well, I just hope people get a chance to read it, and feel free to visit my website, trisharose.com. Let me know what you think. I just really think it's important we do the best we can, because, time is not something we control. So the more we do, the better. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again. All right.